It's Keith Manich again from ATI, and we're with ABRN and AMI today with a new topic, identifying and getting paid for not included operations. I know this is a time-old issue that we've had, and we're seeing it kind of crop up, especially with all the things that are going on in the industry right now. So we thought it would be a good time to revisit some of the things that we may be forgetting in our repair planning processes. And it's always a good time to revisit, especially for some veteran staff that may kind of forget the basics every now and again, that we look at some things that are the basics and maybe capitalize on some of the things that we've been missing. So with that said, we're going to look at non-included operations continue to be an area of opportunity on most repair plans that are created. I personally review lots of estimates each week. And as we go through, whether you call it a repair plan or an estimate, either way, we've got to do what is required to put the vehicle back into pre-accident fit, function, look, and especially with safety systems, they've got to be working. So it's important for us to look at what are all the things that we need to do. So we're going to be discussing the non-included operations, which are used as leverage, even though they're necessary for completing the repairs. So we have third-party payers that push back on some of these things because they don't feel they're necessary. Well, we're going to talk about how do we identify that they are, how do we document that, and how do we make sure that it is put into the repair plan. So this will include developing strategies that may be needed to ensure that accurate payments are made to the repairer for the work performed. We don't want you doing work and not getting paid for it. And we want you doing the work that's required to put the vehicle back into pre-accident functionality, if you will. So we're going to talk about that today. Because we keep hearing, and this is the kind of the battle cry of the third-party payer, we don't pay for that. So it's not uncommon for the collision repair to hear that phrase. So, you know, and it could be an insurance representative, it could be a fleet account, it could be all different kinds of folks. But we want to make sure that with the new safety systems that are being installed, we seem to hear this more frequently, especially when it comes to scanning, especially with pre-scans. We're finding that there's a lot of pushback because you have to prove that the scan is necessary. Well, most manufacturers have changed their language in their position statements to say that this must be done. And why must it be done? It must be done because this basically sets the benchmark for the vehicle. It's something that the engineering departments at all the manufacturers have done, basically to say, this is how we, you know, understand where the vehicle is after the accident. So it's a question of, you know, does the representative just not know that it's got to be done? Or is this a position of the company saying, we're just not going to pay for it unless somebody jumps through the hoops, basically to show us that it needs to be done? So it's a fair question to ask, why aren't these things being identified properly? So those who write the repair blueprints must be well versed in the non-included operations. And we find that continually, even as I do estimator training with my company, we find out that, you know, those things that are assumed to be included are growing, even though it's not in the P pages. So they should be checked 100% of the time. And I think that's one of the things that we miss our opportunity as repair planners, is we're not looking back at those basics to make sure that we've identified them. So, and again, let's face the fact that even seasoned repair planners occasionally miss repair items. We're trying to do things too quickly, and we do miss opportunities that are available to us. So we've got to make sure that we go back and check to make sure that the non-included operations are identified. So the frequency of this occurring is much higher than you would think. So we can pretty much say on about a high 90 percentile, we're seeing things that are typically missed on estimates. So, and when you're looking at the minimum being about $250 and upwards of 750 being the top end of it, there's a significant opportunity there for improving the ARO so that the shop retains significantly more on the same vehicle that might have gone through without those things being identified. So it's an important thing for us to look at. So let's start with the basic. You know, the estimating systems have databases that are developed with advisory councils that include insurance companies. So what those folks want to do is they want to look at and use their DRP experiences as one of their kind of litmus tests for whether something should be included or not included. And what they say is, if we don't see this being done at least 50% of the time, it should be a non-included operation. Well, maybe it's not being done for a variety of reasons, but that doesn't mean that the shop who wants to fix the car properly or not in accordance with an agreement, a predetermined agreement for what should and shouldn't appear, if that shop wants to fix the car right, they're going to identify what's required by the OEM. That is the standard that we should be working from, the OEM procedures. And so as we look at our estimating systems or the guides, which is what they are, the things that aren't identified as part of what the OE would stipulate needs to be done, those things need to be added. So essentially, that's what we're talking about as we go through this process. So as we continue through the basics, even though something has the potential of not being done by somebody, it doesn't mean that it's not or isn't something that should be identified on the repair plan. If I have a good, well-seasoned repair planner, they should be going in and checking the repair procedures for each of these, especially the newer vehicles, each and every time they write a repair plan. And it's not merely that they're doing things that are observed. These are things that should be done because, again, the OEM, the manufacturer of the vehicle, the engineers who design the vehicle say that these things need to be done. So it doesn't make it unnecessary. The blueprinter must then ask for it and justify it. So we get into this friction of, listen, I'm showing you that it's got to be done. You're saying it doesn't have to be done. Here's the information that validates it. And it's a back and forth with friction sometimes rising pretty high because the repair planner identifies that the OEM says something needs to be done, and someone from a third-party payer in fact says that they don't pay for that in this market. They don't pay for it because they don't see other shops. Listen, if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. If it's related to the safety of the vehicle, this is a kind of a no-brainer question here. If it needs to be done and as identified by the manufacturer, it's going on the repair plan, and if somebody doesn't want to pay for it, I'm notifying the customer, and I'm letting the customer understand that these things are required. Here's the documentation that I can provide you that says it needs to be done by the OEM, and you can have that discussion with your third-party payer, whomever that might be, but in fact, I need to do these things to fix the vehicle properly. So the fact that an operation may be required, and again, we use scanning because scanning seems to have floated to the surface as the one that is the kind of the most pushback now, even though it's been well established for 4 or 5 years now that this is something that should have been being done for quite a long time. You know, in order for us to baseline the electronic and sensor systems that even electrical systems in the vehicle, that this scanning has to be done to tell us where we are. That's the baseline. So The manufacturer tells us we've got to do this. Obviously, we have to do it. But some insurers demand that the charge shouldn't occur till the supplement is submitted. And although understanding their logic, it's illogical when it's used against what the engineers say. The engineers say that it must be done to baseline or to show us where the vehicle currently is, not at some point after the fact. So if it's a baselining operation, it's mandatory prior to the disassembly of the vehicle, which could, in fact, remove some of the evidence, the electronic footprint that we would need to identify things within the vehicle. So again, this is an area that, as a repair planner, this is need to know information, not nice to know. And so that's where really the change comes about in looking at these, especially the ADAS processes. Some things are nice to know as you go through the process. These are absolutely need to know, because the vehicle is not going to function properly if we don't do these things. So the OEMs have created their position statements to reinforce the process as required, with some taking a position that it must be as part of their service recommendations. Either one of those to me are equal. So if someone says it's recommended, um, if you don't do it and it's recommended and there's an adverse reaction that occurs, who's going to be responsible for that? So they're going to point to the repair professional being the one who omitted this process, but it is really, in some cases, a third party that is caused that to occur. But as repair professionals, we can't allow that to occur. We've got to do it. So this is an automatic in our operation identifications. And it should be paid for without discussion, because we know that it's required for the vehicle. But again, we continue to have pushback. So some of the OEs have done a really good job now of reformatting their position statements. This one that we're showing now is from Kia. And it says, after a collision has occurred, it is imperative excuse me, to perform both pre-repair and post-repair scan procedures. Imperative, not recommended, not required, imperative. So again, the dynamic is changing a little bit, because what they're doing now is they're informing us as the repair professional, the third-party payer as the one who's got to pay for a professionally written repair plan, and the consumer who owns the vehicle, that these steps that we're taking will put the vehicle back to pre-loss functionality, which is what we need for these safety systems. So again, a DTC alert doesn't always have to illuminate in the dash. You know, we don't see a dash code diagnostic for this. Some of these things are going to be specifically through a DTC that is identified by a scan tool. So use of the scan tool, the process where we use it, and then most importantly, when we use it, are going to be things that we're going to continue to look at. So again, the friction points that we've had here, this step leads to going to a calibration process. And I know y'all just recently had some training through ABRN that was provided by Autel, and they've also provided us with a significant amount of information on their processes and their systems. So it tells us a lot about the calibration steps and what is required and when and so on. So these aren't arbitrary decisions that are being made for when we're putting specific things in the repair plan. These are things that are, these are dynamic, these are always moving, these are things that will be added as new steps are, new processes, new steps, and new sensors are added into the vehicle. So this is going to be an ever-evolving living documentation by vehicle. So it's not something that we don't have to check each time we write the vehicle. We have to check it every time we write the vehicle. So, and I heard this last week, which kind of made me just shudder to think of people thinking this way. But one insurer told one of the repairers that I work with that, oh, these are self-diagnostic systems. They do everything themselves. They can reset themselves. And I'm like, wow, that's really a position that I've not heard before. But we know that it takes a significant amount of work to get get all of our targets set up, get the laser set up and so on, so that we can validate, so that the system, the vehicle, can validate against those things which are required in order for the system in the vehicle to go ahead and do the recalibration, if you will. But it still requires steps from the person or the facilitator or the technician that has to get these things done. So these aren't things we can omit and just kind of be flippant about whether they have to get done or not. These are mandatory steps that are required. So again, it's labor intensive. It's no different than having to set up a three-dimensional measuring system when you're doing structural damage. So, we're going to put the details on the repair plans that we write, and that's more to show someone who may be a little leery of what we're doing that it's required. The manufacturer told us we have to do it. So these are the steps that we're going to follow to make sure that it's done. All we're asking you to do is to reimburse us for what we do. We're not going to charge you for things we're not going to do, but please pay us for what we are doing. These are mandatory steps that we have to provide to ensure that the customer, their safety is not at risk here. So with the documentation and the knowledge that these operations are mandatory and restoring the vehicle back to pre-accident function, why is it that the repair planner has to continue to ask for it? So that's probably going to be an ongoing question that we'll continue to ask. But the only thing that we can maybe surmise out of all of this is that, well, maybe somebody's just trying to save money. Well, we're not going to allow somebody to save money at the expense of the customer being put at risk. So we've got to make sure, we're looking at everything that we're doing to ensure that the customer is able to be put safely back into their vehicle. So it becomes, those folks will use it as leverage in the repair planning conversation, but you know what? It really doesn't belong. It doesn't belong because these are mandatory steps. So some of the other things, and this one isn't new. This has been around for a long time, but another one that I'm hearing more and more pushback on is feather edge prime and block. Why? I don't know, because there's no way I'm going to get my body work done at 150 and then apply paint. So the step that's required between 150 and 400, which is where we would see the vehicle being, remember what the estimating systems say, and they are a guide, but they do say that all refinish operations are predicated on the panel being equal to a new undamaged OE panel, which would mean E code. So if I have a 400 grit primed area that's been feather edge blocked and primed, and now we have it finished with 400, that now puts it back to equal to the E code. So with that being said, we have to look at what are the things that we need to do to get it there. On the right side is a Mitchell definition. On the left side is what we have from a discussion point for this, but nonetheless, it's something that has to get done. These are mandatory steps again. This isn't something that we can just circumvent, not do it, and still end up with a good product. It's a not included refinish operation. Again, that's another key point here. It's a refinish operation, which means we have to add the cost of the materials in addition to the labor that's required to do this. So, why is this something that folks don't want to pay for? Again, we don't know, but the procedure is explicit, and it's a procedure that needs to be followed. So we want to make sure that it is continually being done to what is the specification, if you will, by the paint manufacturers that say it has to get done prior to their finish coats being applied. So the industry acknowledgement for these things is pretty standard. Standard operating procedures exist from the coatings manufacturers, from the material manufacturers. So with all of this information readily available, why is this again something that continues to be an issue for us as repair planners as we're developing the repair plan? So then the other thing that we have is, okay, well, we'll pay you something, but it's going to be done at body time. Well, it's not body time. We've got to apply primer. So the cost of these materials has to be considered as well. So industry support for this is huge. For those of you who may not be familiar with DEG, that's the Database Enhancement Gateway, please access this material. It will help you significantly in making decisions about what you're doing. There's lots of reference information that you can pull up and tell you about different procedures that are already things that they've looked at and created alternative processes for, even looking at times associated with those. But the one thing I like about it is I can access all three database providers. I can access all three of their P pages in this system. So it's a tool. I tend to tell folks that I work with, this is where you find all your information to counter any discussions that you might have with third-party payers about particular things that you're looking at. And I'll give you some examples of some things that they come up with that I think are hugely important because they're often neglected. But this is structural adhesive removal, and it's a non-included operation. So as you remove this panel, and this is right out of the DEG database, there are things that are required before you can reapply the adhesive bonding material to these panels. So I've got to clean it off. I've got to have a bare e-coat, if you will. And as I'm doing that, it says that this is mandatory. And it is required before you reinstall the adhesive. So why is it not being done? And so it talks about removing, in some cases, protective coatings when we're doing welding and things like that. So that means anytime we do that, we're going to have to go back and recoat these areas. So whatever processes that you're using by the paint manufacturer, that's your preference, whatever is required, you've got to go back and make sure that those things are done. So again, as a third-party payer, that's not being considered. So there's consumables that are used in this process. These are parts. So these aren't things that come out of paint materials. Paint materials is for the fluid materials that are going on the car and those things that are required to get the fluid materials to the car. So the masking and plastic and paper and so on that we use for that process. But everything I'm using in preparing the car before I get to that final point where I'm doing the final prep, all of those things are items which we should be charging for. And I'm still scratch my head as to why people think that's free, but those things aren't free. This is a direct cost associated with the repair of the vehicle. This isn't a fixed cost or a cost of doing business. Huge difference between those two things. Fixed costs are, what do I need to open my shop in the morning, turn the lights on, pay for my sewer water, all those kind of things? What do I need to have in my office? All those things that get to the point where the car comes in the store. Once the car comes in the store and we begin working on it, anything associated with that car becomes a direct cost associated with the repair and should be charged out on the repair plan against that particular vehicle. Nothing is free. And we have to make sure that folks understand that. And as we look at these non-included operations, all the tools, equipment, those things that are consumed on that vehicle should go into the direct costs with the vehicle. So some other things that that come up with this is looking at safety inspections. There are a whole host of safety inspections that should be done, especially in ADAS vehicles, even just going back to very simple, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but simpler times with just airbag systems, anti-lock brakes, and things like that. There are specific safety system inspections that need to be done. Um, the labor to perform these operations is not included unless it's specified in the footnotes in any of these estimating systems that we um, are provided with. And in most cases, nothing is related back to the safety inspection. So where do we find them? We're going into the OEM source data again to identify what needs to get done. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but some other things, the torquing of fasteners. This is one that there's continued pushback on, but there's lots of information, lots of literature that supports this. So and I'm not talking about just lug nuts here. I'm talking about all the different fasteners that we work with, because we're working with a lot of one-time use fasteners. So torquing them to spec can only be done once. That bolt, that fastener, then has to be replaced with a new fastener, then that can only be torqued to spec one time. So again, these are specific examples that we run into that are well documented. This is another one that came from DEG. And here's another one: transferring studs, brackets, and braces from one part to another. This isn't something that's just assumed that it's paid for as part of the operation. In all of the estimating systems, it specifically says that these are not included operations. So these things, please take the time. I'm showing data here that comes from existing sources. This isn't new. It may be new that we're looking at it a little bit differently, but we're not taking the time to go through this documentation and use it in its entirety, which will get you paid for the operations and significantly improve your ARO. So these are things that we need to look at. I'll show you this one here. This is from a Toyota document that goes back many years about if we don't have a clear area to break our clear coat, we have to go to the next area, which could include going over the roof and the opposing quarter panel. This is so that the person who's applying the paint to the car can guarantee the job. If we don't, we're going to have a situation now. Again, we're told many times that our DRP shops don't do this. Well, we're not responsible for who fixes a car that way. We're responsible for how we fix a car correctly. And so if we're not melting, which all that is we're reducing the binder that is used to hold the clear coat to the car to the point where we're not seeing the brake line. Well, if we're reducing the binder out, what's going to happen eventually? The binder's going to give way and we're going to have a white streak, and it's going to have to be repainted. And then as a repair professional, I look bad or the shop looks bad. We don't want that. So again, this is hugely important for us to go through these processes the correct way. Here's another one that is becoming a frequent issue is when we put a new panel on the vehicle, if the interior of the panel is a different color other than the dark gray or black e-coat, that we need to paint the underside color back on. Again, not included operation. It is a refinish operation. It needs to be done prior to the panel being installed. So this is something that we need to make sure gets done, and it is something that we charge, and we charge for the materials for this as well. This also is the same if we're welding on the outside of the panel. Let's say I'm putting studs in or whatever, and I create a bare spot or a corrosive hot spot on the inside of the panel. That all has to be restored. If I don't restore that panel back to the pre-loss condition, which means equal to the e-coat, then I've got a panel that's going to have premature failure. So again, who does it come back to? Comes back to the shop. So let's make sure, again, this is a real simple one, but it's something that we should be getting paid for. And along those lines, when we're using consumables, especially welding consumables, those things should be charged out on the repair plan as well. So again, these are maybe some things you haven't been doing in the past, and what you charge really depends on what you pay for it. We're not really here to talk about how much. We're here to talk about what needs to appear in the repair plan. So make sure that we're looking at things like shielding gas, welding tips, and all those things. And one of the other ones that's really been coming up with a pretty high frequency right now is the cost of cycling the booth through the heat cycle. How much should it be? How many BTUs or thermal units are used in the heating of the booth, and what does that cost to produce for the length of time that it is produced? And should that be something that is charged back? Because again, it is a direct cost related to the repair of that vehicle. It's not the standard heat for the shop. This is specific to that particular vehicle. So again, something that we need to look at. So again, here's some things from DEG Web. These are very good sources of information for you. This particular one goes through seam sealers and so on, and it looks at all three estimating systems. We are real fortunate that these folks spend the time that they do to create these documents for us. We need to make sure that they're used, because as you look at this one here, looking at pre and post scanning, there's not a whole lot of included operations on here. All of these things are not included. So with that being said, all of these things should appear in your repair plan to ensure that the shop is getting compensated properly for the work that's being done. I'm gonna go through a few more of these, because it's just things that we are frequently seeing not being paid for that really need to be charged out. If we have glass that's broken and we're going to remove the existing broken glass, the cleanup of that broken glass is not included. It shouldn't be assumed by the third-party payer that that's going to be done free of charge. The cost of the installation material, or a kit, if you will, that's not included. And if you're dealing with a high-mounted stop lamp, nothing that's associated with this removal includes that part of the process. So again, these are 3 line items, one of which uses material that should be included in your repair plan, because it is not included in the estimating system for what you're doing on the particular vehicle. So again, these are, as we look at this, the typical estimate that's written, again, I said earlier, it's anywhere from $250 to about $750 that we're seeing that is missed. That means that it's a significant amount of money. I don't care who you are as a repairer, that's a significant amount of money. So if you look at that times the amount of vehicles that you do weekly, monthly, and then annually, and you annualize the amount that was missed, it becomes a significant amount of money. So some specific examples that I want to look at. Again, the blue arrow points to the not included items. And this is listed under basic color application. So this one is masking. So cover the or mask in the engine, cover or mask the entire exterior of the vehicle to prevent overspray damage, etc. As we go through these are all things that are not included. So please do yourselves a favor after you get done this presentation. Just take a look at whatever estimating system you've got. I don't care which one it is. Go back in and look at your P pages and see just exactly what you can charge for, and then compare that to what you've written, and take a look at the things that you've missed, because I will challenge you that it's probably a significant amount of money, and we've got to make sure that we're going through and getting paid for these things. So know your system. As you can see from the examples, there are opportunities that aren't being identified that could improve, and when I say improve, improve significantly the repair planner's ability to increase the average repair order. We're looking right now at some kind of lean times, not as many vehicles through the store. So what it helps us to do is take vehicles that we've already captured. We don't have to do any new marketing, anything on those. They're already in the store, and really take a good hard look at the non-included operations and make sure that we've identified everything. Time must be taken to explore all possibilities and not accept the "we don't pay for that position." That's not something that we should be even thinking about. It's what can we justify, what can we show you in writing, and how are we going to charge for it. A lot of these things will be adjuster or estimator established times. Just make sure that we're identifying them and addressing them. If the time is taken on the front side in the repair process, another thing this helps us do is to reduce any stall time that may occur, where we now have to ask for something in process. We have to wait for somebody to come back and do a reinspection, or we've got to commit to sending a bunch of photos. These things typically stop or create production stoppages, or in my world, it creates waste, and that's waste that costs the store money. So here we're losing it on two ends. We didn't identify it properly first, then we're stopping to identify it after the initial inspection, and we're creating a situation where we're stopping during production, which sometimes is even worse. So the key is to reduce that situation by making sure that all necessary details completed, especially on your internally created repair plans. Listen, when you're getting something from a third party, you know you're going to have issues with how they're written, but take the time ahead of time before you get the car into production to identify those areas of opportunity. Do that meticulous disassembly of the vehicle before you start working on it. Have all those things kind of hammered out with that third-party payer before you put the vehicle into production. That way you're reducing not only the friction time, but you're reducing the time that is required for setting up the supplements and having them come back later. So again, knowing your system, I can go into that DEG site like I told you, click on estimating. I can pull up all three of the estimating system P pages for me to validate all the requirements that I'm looking to be paid for. So again, be real familiar with what you're doing. The other thing I use this for pretty consistently is if someone says, well, my system doesn't pay for this and your system requires it, I use these two to kind of match up against each other to say, okay, yeah, it doesn't say that in yours, but it says these three other things which you didn't include. So, okay, let's make sure that's in here. And then, all bases are covered. So again, this is something that we need to make sure that we're doing to ensure that the vehicle is in fact repaired properly. So just some other things in knowing your system. The cumulative effect of supplements, as we start to see supplements, they are beginning to be excessive. When I see a supplement that is equal to the initial estimate, we're seeing this a lot with the estimates that are written off photos. Pretty much we're seeing the percentage of accuracy on them at somewhere around 27%. So that means that whoever is writing the supplement is writing, 3 times what was initially written in order to get to what the actual repair should be. So again, knowing the system is going to help us make sure that we're getting everything we are entitled to. You know, these two slides that I just showed you here, these are all items that were missed off the initial estimate. And as you look at these, there are ones that there's not a reason in the world for these things to have been missed, other than somebody just picked a time or picked a particular operation and didn't take the time to go through all the other operations that need to be done to in order to make sure that this part or the process is done completely. So again, know what to charge for. Going through some of these things like panel bonding adhesives, doing the feather edge prime and block, those things are things that are absolutely necessary to do to a panel once it's been repaired. Depending on the estimating system that you use, they will allocate different times for those. So we're not going to really talk about time, but we'll talk about the operation. The operation has to be identified, and it is a refinish operation in that particular one. But I've got things in here replacing sound deadening pads, things like that. These are routinely missed items. I don't know whether people think they can be used over, but they can. So we've got to make sure that we're accounting for these things. Again, we're making sure that you know, and another one, we talked a little bit about welding, but destructive test panels to make sure that whatever welding operations that you're using are appropriate for the materials that you're replacing. You're going to start seeing this as one that should be done 100% of the time before we go ahead and begin doing our welding processes. This is something that ICAR says needs to be done. All the welding manufacturers of welding equipment say that it should be done, but people push back on you know, paying for that operation. Well, a test weld, again, validates that the process we're using is required. Number one, it's required for the vehicle. Number two, we've tested it to ensure or validate ourselves that it works fine. Now we're going to apply it to the vehicle itself. So there's no reason for it not to be paid for. And here's another one that is it's becoming more of an issue that we've seen over the last couple of years, but adhesive cure time. Now, how you work with this is up to you, but very specifically, the manufacturers of the products say that there is a 24-hour full cure time for these materials. This is one in particular, but most of them follow pretty much the same logic. So I can quick cure it so I can move the vehicle, but it doesn't fully cure for 24 hours. So it's got to be at 24 hours, and in this particular case, it says 73 degrees. So I'm in the middle of winter in a northern state, and we typically run the heat back down to 50 at night. Now I've got to keep it for 24 hours at 73 degrees. What does that mean? And it's done, again, this is specifically for this particular vehicle. So, you know, make a decision as to whether that is something that you're going to look at on your estimates for cure time. Again, this is new material, new repair methodology, new vehicles, very specific processes that they're asking for. And we're not talking about bonding something that we want to bond versus the manufacturer saying that it's got to be bonded. These are very specific. Use Mopar as an example on the Jeep Grand Cherokee, very specific processes for adhesives. So what are we doing to compensate the shop for the time frame that the curing is required to take place for? Are they being compensated for that? So again, not included operations that we need to get paid for. Kind of one of my my personal pet peeves that we've had: total loss processing. This is a whole list of things that have to get done when you process a total loss for a third-party payer. So with these 44 items that are listed, you know, what are you charging? Are you charging anything? If you're not charging something, I would tell you to make sure that you you know, do a clip of this and get this form so that you can take a look at it. But what I've done is looked at what are all the steps that are required in the process, and I've tried to put what I think the time frame for doing all of these things are, and it gives a pretty good idea of the labor that is required to process a total loss for someone. Then there's also charges for things like photographs when you're taking 25, 30 photographs of the vehicle. These are all things to make sure that that claim file has everything that's required to meet their requirements. So if that's being done, why aren't the shops being compensated for all those steps that in fact provide the information so that the claim file can be completed? So take a look at this again. If you're currently handling total loss vehicles without considering them as a profit center, the total loss as a profit center, you're probably doing yourself a big disservice. The chart at the right identifies the charges that should be assessed or can be assessed. It's just still your decision whether you do it or not. The responsibility for the charge associated with total loss are that of that third-party payer or the insurance company. Shops shouldn't be providing free services. Each time you've got someone spending time to get these things done, we've got to make sure that you're being compensated for that. Otherwise, you're working for free. I said a little bit earlier about component testing after a crash. A couple different documents I want to show you here real quick as we're winding down, but Ford safety belt systems. There are component tests that need to be done on retractors, buckles, any tethers or bracket assemblies for child safety, locking retractors, all of these things. And on the right is the actual document that's listed. This is off of 2012 Fusion, and it tells you what the component tests are. If you're not doing these tests, you need to do them. But if you are doing them, you need to get paid for them. And so you can identify, and again, it's adjuster or estimator assessed time frame that you would do, but make sure that these are being done, because this is ensuring that the customer is back in the same position they were with the vehicle prior to the loss. So again, it validates that things are done. Here's some more information from Ford. It's a 3-page document on their procedures, so it's well worth taking the time. I think we access this one through AllData, but it is an OE document. You can identify it and access it right through the OEM as well. But failure to follow this instruction may result in incorrect operation of safety belt system and increases the risk of serious personal injury or death in a crash. That tells me it needs to get done. And again, it's telling us that the OEM specifies that it needs to be done. This is one from General Motors, same kind of information. And again, this is accident with or without airbag deployment. These are the component inspections that they require. And this is another multi-page document. So this adds a significant amount of labor into your process. And the inspections really need to be done to ensure that the vehicle will perform as it did during the first loss in any subsequent accidents after it's repaired. So performing inspections is part of what we call the validation process for the components, and it gives you an entire list of things that you should be looking at and doing to ensure that the vehicle, again, is safe after it is repaired. So again, there's the last page, but it's the mounting points for different hardware. There's a whole bunch of different things that this is asking you to do. And this is a 2014 document, so this isn't new. This has been on the books for about 6 years now. So if you haven't been doing it, let's start doing it. And if you start doing it, let's make sure that you have the documentation so that you can validate for any third-party payer that they need to be compensating you properly for it. So with that said, dig deep into the repair procedures and identify everything that is required by the OEM to put the vehicle back into pre-loss condition. Validate it, make sure that you're getting compensated for it. But again, dig deep and find out everything that you should and can be doing. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to spend with us over this. Again, my name is Keith Manich. I am director at the Training Institute and Automotive Training Institute, and we do all kinds of repair processes. We look at repair processes. We look at ways that estimating should be done thoroughly and completely. We will come back and spend more time with ABRN. And I'd like to thank you all for participating today. Don't forget, you want to take your AMI test once you get this completed so that you can get credit for that as well. But thanks for your time, and look forward to seeing you next time.